Okay, so this is the counter offer. Whether you're a buyer or you're a seller, let's say you're a buyer and you've submitted an offer, and the seller doesn't like some of the terms, and I'm representing you as a buyer's agent. We would get this document back, countering us on certain terms. So they're not, obviously, there are going to be some things that they'll accept more than likely and some things that they want to change. And then depending on the conversation, so a lot of times, what I'll tell you is usually there's quite a few conversations that happen between myself and the cross agent. So regardless of which side I am representing, there's usually a lot of conversations because neither one of us want 15 of these going back and forth. And honestly, most clients, most buyers and sellers, neither one of them want to go back and forth that many times. Even 2 or 3 times, it can get just super tedious. And so we try to kind of figure out, okay, where are the pressure points? Where are the pain points for both sides? Let's work it out. Let's have conversations around it. And then either write a clean purchase contract from the very beginning and have all the verbal negotiations done, or we will, if there's a couple of things that are just a little unclear or whatever, then we'll counter them back with something, but a lot of times there's a lot of conversations happening back and forth prior to. Sometimes we have to clean up a couple of things in the purchase contract with a counter offer. So depending on how many counters we go back and forth, that number would be here. So if we're on counter offer number 1, you would put 1 here. If you're on counter offer number 3, you would put 3 here. And then depending on who is it, if we're, the first counter offer will always be from the seller. So the buyer submits their offer. So the counter offer would be originated by the seller. That would be counter offer number 1. Anything after that, note that like pretty much even numbers are going to be from the buyer, odd numbers are going to be from the seller. So if it's counter offer to the offer, we would say that here. If we're on counter offer number 2, then we would check this box and put the date that, whatever counter offer we were on. Then obviously seller, landlord, premises address is all here. Now, then we go into certain things that, we want to counter. So let's say close of escrow date doesn't work for the seller. So we write an offer stating that we want to close February 15th. Well, that doesn't work for the seller. The seller needs a little extra time. They want a longer escrow period. So they would counter us back and they would write line blah, blah, blah of the purchase contract is going to be, they want to close February 20th, for example. They just need a little extra time. They're waiting on their house to get done, whatever it is, whatever the circumstances are, they would counter that. Obviously, the most often thing that we see is purchase price. We tend to see counters around purchase price more than anything else. That's the most important thing to both parties. How much am I paying for this house? How much am I getting for this house? That's really where the biggest sticking point is. We'll see some negotiation around incentive or concessions. So let's say that a buyer is asking for 3% in seller concessions, and the seller doesn't want to provide 3%. Maybe they only want to give 1.5%, or they don't want to give anything. So they would counter back and say, purchase price to be X amount. Like let's say we listed for 500, we got an offer for 480. Seller's willing to come down a little bit, so they counter back at 490, try to meet them in the middle. Okay, but then they're not willing to provide the 3% in closing costs. In addition to that, they're only willing to provide 1.5%. Then all of that would be written right here in this section, whatever it is. And typically what I do when I do these counter offers is I call out the specific line or lines in the purchase contract. So it's very clear what part of the contract I'm referencing. Because what happens is every single one of these documents, however many times we go back and forth, they all go to the title company and they all go to the lender. And so, let's say that we're going back and forth about price and we're on our 3rd counter offer. Everything else we're good on. Like we've agreed to 1.5% in concessions. We've agreed to, but we're still not there on money. And, one party or the other will only do it via, a counter offer instead of a bunch of verbal. We get to an agreement and then it's written up by whoever's turn it is to write it up. Then in that case, we would write in, that the purchase price is $495 and $750, whatever we come to terms with on. And then we would write anything else that we're countering on, we would write that in there. But then we would write all other terms and conditions remain the same. So anything that wasn't previously addressed ends up being that whatever the last counteroffer is the superseding document to the terms of the contract. So if the contract said 480 and we agree at 495 750, then that's going to supersede the purchase contract because the counteroffer came after. I hope that makes sense. So that's how this is filled out, and then we put in a deadline for who responds, or let's say if the seller's responding to the buyer, then they're giving them maybe 24 hours to respond, and then the seller would sign here, and then the buyer would have one of two choices. We would either respond back with a second counter or accept the terms of the counter, depending on where we're at in the process. So, and then that just happens back and forth until we finally come to terms on whatever the purchase price is going to be, or whatever the terms of the contract are that matter the most to each side, so that both sides feel like they got a fair deal.